Yeah, clothing with the like set. I think like set. I think
is what happens every week. But
I didn't have it with me
it's
once.
extra stuff. I did, you know, just be a little hard to teach it. Once a week.
No.
For an hour, for a game that lasts like 45 minutes. Yeah, it's live at least.
No, nothing specific. You can take any of the sandwiches.
Well, I think I just, but it's a lot more intense.
That's what I see. Sandwiches.
So the games are just more intense. So it's been really fun. Because they've been playing together.
In other words.
And they're actually starting to
I'm trying to think. I mean, Thomas is pretty good too, so I'm trying to.
So
I played them with Thomas and Jason. So also the probably we're gonna have so the probably have this on the handful of the students.
So that's what I was thinking. So maybe having.
I'm gonna start coaching the Thomas people better. I'm nationally certified.
So why don't we do that?
I used to coach soccer.
And
I missed it.
they didn't have annotations. So I have one or two. And
Good to go?
This team, Liam's
And somewhere over here, unless I want to be a disembodied voice.
So we basically don't have.
Here, this is okay?
Playing, so it looks like there's a block, like a normal.
All right, well, welcome here, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. I just want to introduce, for those of you, I see a few faces I haven't seen at the event, but just want to emphasize what we try to do with this particular speaker series, which is give us, as a community, an opportunity to hear some of the most significantly relevant researchers in the EdTech landscape, and to provide an opportunity for faculty and staff at UTA to begin to track folks that I think and that we as a lab think are critical in shaping where education is going and are doing work that's going to be relevant in the longer term for UTA as a whole. Today I'm extremely pleased to introduce colleague and friend Ryan Baker. He's got a significant history in areas of educational data mining, and more recently been taking some of that expertise to apply it to looking at elements or predictive models and affective attributes of learning. Ryan was the founding president for the International Educational Data Mining Society. He's one of the first folks that, when we were forming the Society for Learning Analytics Research about 4 or 5 years ago, he was one of the first folks that we reached out to bring into our community as well, given the profile and the influence that he's had. He taught last year a rather large course on educational data mining. I think you had 30, 40,000, 50,000 students. I'm not sure your number was, but it was...
I'm not sure either.
Okay, I was quite significant participation in that course, and he's co-teaching a MOOC that we're doing starting in about 3 weeks here with UTA, and Carolyn Rose, who spoke yesterday, and others that are going to be involved in that course as well. Anyway, over to you, Ryan. Great to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Well, thank you, George. Thank you for your kind words. It's a great honor to speak here. I was just commenting before the talk that it's an honor to be part of such an exciting lineup of speakers over the semester. I mean, I'm not used to seeing such a great list of names over such a period of time, such a short period of time, and it's an honor to be part of that list of names. So I'll be talking about some of our work towards better and more general prediction models of engagement. So I just said what I just said, but it's also nifty to be giving a talk near where I grew up, because I grew up near here in DeSoto, Texas. Haven't been back for a little while. It's where I got my fashion sense. So. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to tell you about some of our work to measure engagement in online learning. So more and more learners are using online learning systems every day. And whereas it may just be an LMS to get the lecture notes and to upload assignments, it also may be an interactive learning environment like some of these. So for example, here you see a picture of INKITS, the Inquiry Intelligent Tutoring System, where students learn science domain content by experimenting with simulations and seeing what happens. Or Newton's Playground, which is a game where students learn physics concepts by actually drawing on the screen and trying to get a ball to a target. And they have to do pulleys and weights and balances. This is EcoMove, which is a virtual environment where you wander around a world and pick up objects and solve mysteries. This is Reasoning Mind, which is a math tutor for elementary school math, where students are taught math through story content, which embeds the math in it, very conceptually based, and actually based right here in Texas and used in DeSoto, Texas, the school that I went to for high school. This is Assessments, which is a mathematics tutoring system for middle school, which assesses while it assists. So while the student is doing their math homework, it's actually getting data on their math knowledge that it presents the next day to the teacher, so the teacher can adapt their instruction. And it's able to predict the Massachusetts State Math Exam, as well as the Massachusetts State Math Exam can predict itself. So you might say, who needs the State Math Exam at some point? Some of these systems are used by tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of students a year. And some systems can be very engaging. And engagement matters. It's been shown repeatedly using various different methods to be associated with differences in student outcomes, including do you graduate high school? Do you succeed in your job? Do you pass the year in college? Do you major in the field that you were engaged or disengaged in several years after the data? I'll talk about that example during the talk. Turns out that different curricula have a lot of variation in engagingness. For example, if you look at boredom, you've got some systems like Assessments, unfortunately, which I've done a lot of work with. Students are bored almost a quarter of the time, and other games where students are bored a lot less. Incidentally, it's not like the games are less boring, because across all the studies my lab's ever done, Math Blaster, which was an award-winning game, was the most boring educational environment we ever studied. Turns out that award-winning and how kids respond to it are not the same thing. So this creates an opportunity and a challenge. Can we develop systems, online learning systems, that recognize when a student's becoming disengaged and adapt to improve their engagement? Can we assess which materials are less engaging to drive redesign? And can we determine which students are less engaged to provide predictive analytics that may be relevant and useful for their teachers, their guidance counselor, or their parents? And it depends on solving a measurement challenge. Who's engaged and disengaged? How are they engaged or disengaged? Because it's not like it's just you're engaged or not. There's various ways you can be engaged. And when is the student engaged or disengaged? How can we do this? Traditional methods for doing this involve things like video coding or field observation. And these work, but they don't scale particularly well. The Gates Foundation recently completed its Measuring Effective Teaching study, where they spent about $60 million to code a couple 100,000 hours of video data. Some of the methods I'll talk about today, actually, we've been able to code about half as much data with $100,000. So it's a big difference. And field observation is not actually as expensive as video coding, but it still requires having a person go out to class all the time. There's also late 21st century methods like physiological sensors, like the webcam, skin conductance sensor to see if the kid is sweating, heart rate sensor, see if their heart is racing particularly fast because of some exciting mathematical theorem, or the kid next to them. Posture sensor, EEG, fMRI, coming to a classroom near you. And I like to say these are late 21st century methods because they may work at some point, but they're not very feasible today. They're difficult. The models, we can make pretty good models of engagement from this kind of technology. We can infer what someone's engagement is, but they're difficult to embed in schools. They cost a lot of money. That's moving away a little bit because webcams are getting cheaper and more embedded. There's also breakage. Wynn Burleson did a study of an advanced physiological sensor set up in a school in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Holyoke. I don't know a good analogy around here, but because everything's changed. But Holyoke is one of the lower performing school districts in Massachusetts. Big social problems. 60% breakage per day. Kids were actively destroying the instruments. And there's political challenges. A lot of parents don't want you to wire up their kids with lots of sensors. And a lot of political pundits don't want it even more strongly. I know. Yeah, it's so strange. But yeah, most parents are not so excited about you wiring up their kids with an EEG while they're learning math. So one of the big research questions my group has had over the last few years is, can we detect engagement solely from student interactions with software? So we don't have to worry about doing invasive things that will concern people and that may have other negatives. So we try to combine the flexibility and power of data mining and machine learning with the best possible ground truth labels. So we get data on what kids are actually engaged, and we try to make models that can replicate that. I'll talk about that in a minute. And a thorough theoretical study of the constructs being modeled. We try to bring these three things together to get reliable and valid measurements. And the goal is measurements that are, first of all, automated. They're able to make assessments about students, possibly in real time, with no human being in the loop. So we can make these assessments without having to have a human being grading. Second of all, fine-grained, able to make assessments about students second by second, so we can know what content is more and less engaging. And third, validated, demonstrated to apply to new students in new contexts. So let me start. I've been talking about engagement this whole time, and I gave the example of boredom, but what is engagement? Corno and Mandenack call it an elusive variable, and I couldn't resist this picture. I grew up here, so I feel like I can make a Cowboys joke. What I don't tell you is I make the same joke in other cities with their local teams. But there's several perspectives on engagement in the literature. Fredericks, Blumenfeld, and Paris refer to three dimensions. Behavioral engagement. So your behaviors indicate if you're engaged or not engaged. Things like, do you persist? How much effort do you put on? Do you participate? Are you involved? Are you paying attention? Cognitive engagement, like cognitive investment in learning, metacognition, self-regulated learning. And emotional or affective engagement, the emotional reactions to a learning situation, including students' feeling of interest, boredom, happiness, anxiety, frustration, and so on. The work that I do mostly focuses on behavioral engagement and emotional or affective engagement, in part because I think cognitive engagement is harder to identify what's cognitive and what's engagement. If a student is if a student's failing to engage in self-regulated learning, does that mean that they're disengaged, or does it mean that they don't know the relevant strategy? Early work on behavioral engagement, and there's I've got sites back to the 60s, but in fact there's sites for this back to the 1880s if you want it. Early work on behavioral engagement tended to focus primarily on whether a student was on task or off task. And work since then has begun to consider the multiple ways that disengagement or engagement manifests behaviorally, and that's a tradition that my lab follows. So we try to infer student engagement from their interaction with log files, with learning software. And some of the constructs we model, I'll talk about how we build the models in a minute, include, first of all, off-task behavior. So the classic one. When a student completely disengages from the learning environment and the task to engage in unrelated behavior. For example, talking to another student about One Direction. Everyone here familiar with One Direction? Okay, they're a boy band. They've been popular for 2 or 3 years. They're still popular. I looked on the web. There's no emerging boy bands more popular right now. So a student's telling another kid about One Direction. Maybe they're reading a magazine about One Direction. Maybe they're surfing the web to read blog posts on One Direction. Or maybe they're playing an online One Direction video game. My daughter does. Or maybe the student is sleeping. But, given some of what I've seen in classrooms the last couple of years, they're probably dreaming of One Direction. Gaming a system is another disengaged behavior. Intentionally misusing educational software to complete problems in advance without learning. So for example, let's say a student is using a learning system where they have to type in an answer. It tells them if they're right or wrong. Some students might type in 1. System says they're wrong. 2. System says they're wrong. 3. Wrong. 4. Wrong. 5. 6. 7. We saw one student do that up to 38. They get through the problems, not really very learning focused. Another one's hint abuse. Some software systems where you can ask for a hint, and if you ask for a hint again, it'll eventually give you more and more hints until it'll just give you the answer. Some students will go click, 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 answer. Click, 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 answer, and go on like that. Careless errors, another piece of evidence of disengagement. That's making errors despite knowing the relevant skills or concepts. So an example might be if somebody in this room said 2 + 2 = 22. It's not that you don't actually know what 2 + 2 is, it's that you just weren't paying close enough attention. What we call WTF behavior. It stands for without thinking fastidiously. Any other acronym is coincidence. Students actively participating in the learning task, but in a fashion that's not targeted towards completing that task. So for example, let's say a student's supposed to be plotting points on a graph, they plot a smiley face instead. Or perhaps a student is using a simulation microworld, and instead of running a simulation and seeing what happens. They just pause, unpause, pause, unpause, pause, unpause, pause, unpause. Or another example is in a virtual environment, in the Crystal Island virtual environment, where students were supposed to be gathering evidence and talking to people and coming to a conclusion of why people are getting sick. Instead, the students would get bananas off a tree, carry them to a toilet, put them in the toilet. Get bananas from a tree, put them in the toilet, and do that for a half hour. So the student is certainly using the environment, but not in a way that's really targeted towards learning the science content. In terms of affect, there's a ton of affective states, and like a long history of literature, we focus on 4 constructs that come from work by Sidney DeMello at Notre Dame that have been shown in a lot of studies to either have particularly important theoretical links to learning or good empirical evidence for their connection. First one is engaged concentration, which is positive focused concentration towards the task. And this is related to Csikszentmihalyi's construct of flow. But we don't use flow because, as a term because Csikszentmihalyi's theory has so many things that you have to have and makes it carries a lot of theoretical baggage about whether the difficulty is perfectly aligned to skill and so on. We're just talking about the zoning in focus. Boredom, frustration, confusion. So our method of making automated models is we first get human assessments of engagement and disengagement. So we're starting with a human being. We're going to replicate the human being as well as we can, and then we're going to throw the human being out. This is me, the human being, not the student. So a person like me goes to the classroom, takes observations of whether the student is engaged or disengaged. I'll show you an example in a minute. And we synchronize it using an Android app to the log files from the educational software. So we can see exactly what was going on in the software at the same time that we're taking the observations. Then we use data mining to develop models that replicate those human judgments. They're actually about a third to half as good as human beings, using just log files. So how do we get those field observations? How do we get the ground truth? How do we get the labels of who's bored and when they're bored? We use something called the Brompt protocol, which is a field observation protocol designed to collect data in a holistic fashion on student affect and behavior while reducing disruption of the student. So for example, I'll show you a video of this in a minute. We do things like observe with peripheral vision or side glances, hover over a student not being observed. So I know I'm going to go off camera for a second, but so if I'm hovering over George, it means I'm actually watching Shane, and Shane's actually looking at me very intently right now. Right? He doesn't want me to catch him not being on task, whereas Dragon is off task. And we do 20-second round-robin observations of several students. So we go in a predefined order: Shane, George, Dragon, Abelardo, and then on to the next row. This method's conducted through an Android app called Heart, which is free to anyone who wants to use it. It's on my webpage. You can download it, use it on your phone. We also, if you're interested in getting trained in the Brompt protocol that uses it, we do trainings. We don't actually have, I don't think we have any Brompt certified coders here in Dallas Metro, but we might actually, because we have like 5 or 6 we've trained with Reasoning Mind, and one of them might be located here. We definitely have like 6 in the state of Texas. We get with this method iterator reliability of around 0.8 for behavior, that's Cohen's kappa, around 0.65 for affect. So in other words, our coders agree with each other as to whether a kid is bored or not. 65% better than the base rate. And we've trained 71 coders in the US, Philippines, and India. And the process of adapting it to another country is actually a lot more work than just training new people in the same country. So if anyone here is interested in your lab or personally using it, we can get you trained. Here you see one picture of it. This is from some of our work in India. And I don't know how well this can be seen in the back, but notice she's watching the students here, but she's oriented kind of in a different... So she's watching the student over here, but she's oriented physically towards a different student than the one she's observing. This is the leader of Brompt India. I'm Shokanab. And here's another video of me doing some observations. And I encourage you to watch my eyes. I encourage you to watch my eyes when I get this to work. I'm observing the student in front of me, not the one to the side I appear to be looking And you may have seen the quick micro glance that I did at one point when I wasn't entirely able to see what I wanted to see. But mostly it doesn't look like I'm looking at the student in front of me. And that's one of the key ways to reduce observer effects. It's also why we have to do 2 or 3 days of training. So some people ask me, can you really tell when a student's bored? This is open to debate, so let's watch. Watch the gentleman on the left. So you might say he's just tired. It's funny, the sound didn't quite work right, but watch what he's doing now. Watch how he's shifting around, trying to avoid even looking at the screen. This is how you can disambiguate tiredness from boredom. That wasn't a tired yawn, because if it was, he would have gone back to the activity in kind of a normal fashion, instead of avoiding looking at the screen and kind of shifting around. So we synchronize the data from the student's interaction with software, those field observations. We distill meaningful data features for the learning environment. That's based on a qualitative study of the log files, the experience of the field observers, and past experience with other data sets. I'll actually go into some detail on that in a minute. We develop an automated detector using an off-the-shelf classification algorithm. So we're not doing any fancy data mining here. We're just using kind of data mining algorithms from the 1980s and tools from, standard usage. Then we validate the models on new students, new lessons, and new populations to make sure that they don't just work on by overfitting to the existing population. So the feature distillation process, the features of student behavior within the learning environment that we're going to try to map to those observations, this is the secret sauce of engagement detection. Unmodified log files typically aren't sufficient for developing good detectors. So we take things like simple semantic features, like the time taken between actions, the widget involved in the action, the skill that problem step is annotated with, and annotations of correctness and hint use. And by the way, these are examples from a math tutor, but we've done similar processes for a lot of different kinds of environments. I'll talk about that in a sec. This is a good start. It's better than just pure clickstream data, but it's not really sufficient. Then we do kind of some straightforward transformations. Like, we don't just look at the time taken, 6 seconds, but we say, how many standard deviations slower or faster is this than the average student time on the same activity? So for example, if an activity typically takes students 40 seconds to answer, we should interpret 6 seconds very differently than for something that typically takes students 5 seconds to answer. We also look at the history of help requests on the relevant skill, the number of incorrect actions during the observation period. This is kind of good enough to get decent baseline results. We then kind of we build off our past work. We've been, as I'll show in a minute, we've been doing this for a lot of different systems. We take features created for past projects and existing models, such as things like Bayesian knowledge tracing. Bayesian knowledge tracing is kind of the classic method for estimating student knowledge while it's changing. So it's different than the case of a standardized exam, where you're trying to measure static student knowledge. You don't assume a student is becoming radically different in their skill during the exam. Here, the knowledge is changing while it's being measured. And things like unitized time, and when it turns out when you multiply unitized time last 3 actions versus times unitized time last 5 actions, that catches kind of shifts from fast to slow that occur across a few actions. It's one of these things that just works in a lot of models. This is generally useful. We then do structured feature brainstorming by domain experts, field observers, and EDM practitioners. This almost always leads to better models. We actually have a very rigorized method for doing this that involves pizza and beer. The beer is very important. It makes people more open. They get more. I'm not saying you have to use beer, but my grad students seem to like when I offer that. And we also use an introduction of bias in favor of features thought to have higher constructability by domain experts. So we don't just throw a bunch of features, throw spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. We're actually using a little bit of a pass where we bias in favor of what experts in the domain think is going to be relevant. And this actually doesn't make our models better on the current data sets, but leads to better generalizability to new data sets. Then we do structured interviewing. We've actually recently started doing structured interviewing of domain experts and field observers, followed by creation of rational models, human-defined models, and then further discussion with the domain experts and field observers where we actually look at them. We then don't use those models. Those models aren't as good as our data mine models, but by breaking down the operators we use in those models, we then conduct data mining using those operators that were particularly important, that kind of came out as important when human beings were trying to recognize the construct. And it turns out that leads to better models yet. So in other words, this kind of blend of human judgment, human wisdom, and throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, that blend leads to much better models. And Luc Paquette is a postdoc I work with who found that we were able to take a construct gaming a system where we've been working on modeling from it since 2003. We kind of hit a plateau in about 2008, and he was able to get a model about 50% better. So, what kind of algorithms do we use when we throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks? We typically try to take a small set of algorithms that fit different kinds of patterns. Because if you use 70 algorithms, you're going to find something better by chance. But if you take a small number of things that are all kind of good for educational data like this, but that fit very different kinds of patterns, that tends to be a good approach for exploring the space a little more systematically while not being as vulnerable to just luck. I tend to like decision trees, decision rules, step regression, which for arcane reasons seems to work better than logistic in these problems. The statisticians always like logistic better because it's got nice closed form expressions. Step regression seems to work just a little bit better for these kind of problems. Instance-based classification, that's where I say, I want to know if Abelardo is bored. So who is the most similar to Abelardo in this room? Aha, it's Dragon and George. And they're not bored, so Abelardo must not be bored. We assess the models using my favorite metric, and you don't use just one metric, but for reporting it's kind of hard to give 7 metrics. I like A prime. It's the model's ability to take an urn of bored students, an urn of non-bored students, pick a student out of each urn, what's the probability you can tell which is which? So, for example, let's say that Shane is bored and George is not bored. And there's a 52% chance that Shane is bored, and there's a 48% chance that George is not bored, then the model will say, okay, you get credit. Chance A prime is 50% because you're picking one marble out of each urn. Perfect is 100%. First level medical diagnostics, typically you want above 0.8. It's similar to the area under the ROC curve. I always warn people, don't actually use area under the ROC curve because most implementations are buggy. And we also use Cohen's kappa, the degree to which the model is better than the base rate. 0 means that the model is at the base rate, and 100% means it's perfect. And whether you are between 0 and 1 is what percentage of the way you are between those. So we validate our models by, first of all, doing student-level validation, where we split the students into n groups, and we repeatedly train on all the groups but one, build them on all the groups but one, and test it on the last group. We do that for every combination of groups. So we're not testing how the model does on the same data we built the model on, we're testing on new data, and specifically new students. That turns out to be really important because just training on more data from the same students means you overfit to the characteristics of those students. Sometimes students have weird individual ways of using systems. Content level validation, where we break down the content into separate sets and train on some content and test on others. And population level validation, which I'll talk about in a minute, where we train on some populations of students and test on other ones. To make sure our model won't just work on new students, but students drawn from different distributions. We built the detectors for a few different systems, including the ones I mentioned earlier, like Assessments, the math tutor, where you do math problems, and the simulation environments, and database tutors, and programming language stuff, and other math systems, and VMedic, which the Army uses to train combat medics, and Newton's Playground. Then specifically discuss assessments in the rest of the talk. Assessments, again, web-based math tutor for middle school math, gives a kid a math question, offers multi-step hints if the student can't get it, and if the student gets it wrong, the system gives them scaffolding which breaks down the question into simpler questions, and then builds them back up. Used by about a little over 50,000 kids. I think it's actually getting closer to 60,000 this last year. You can see from this that it's kind of most densely used in Massachusetts. Actually, half the kids in the state of Maine use it. Maine's the biggest state for it. They're doing a big randomized controlled trial where they randomly assign half the kids in Maine to use it and half the kids not to use it. Not too heavily used in this region. As you guys probably know, educational technology innovations tend to be very regional. So Reasoning Mind has got Texas pretty well sewed up, and if you're not using Reasoning Mind in middle school, late elementary, you're probably using Think Through Math in Texas. Whereas nobody's using either of those two systems except for my daughter in the northeastern U.S. Assessments leads to better learning than traditional homework, leads to better learning than traditional classroom practice, closes gaps in student learning, and again, a large-scale RCT ongoing in May. So we got data. We went on to field observations. We did 3,600 observations, 20 seconds apiece. That's a good chunk of time out in the classroom. In 6 schools, 505 students. We had a diverse population, including urban, rural, and suburban kids, from very low per capita income to average. How good were our models? So boredom was our worst model. It was only able to tell a bored student from a non-bored student 63% of the time, 22% better than chance. And again, human beings are typically 60% better than chance at agreeing with each other, so we're about a third as good as people. Our best models were off-task behavior and gaming a system, which had A primes in the 0.8s, which again, first-level medical diagnostics typically is 0.8. So some of our models are actually getting up to the level of first-level medical diagnostics. So when you think, is this model of gaming any good? Think you'd give somebody an injection based on this model. I won't go into too much detail on the actual features, but I wanted to give a quick technical piece of detail, which is models trained only on students from a single population, our urban, suburban, or rural kids, work well in that population, but they actually don't work very well for different populations, where they're just better than chance. And then we put all 3 populations together and said, what if we train on urban, rural, and suburban students? And it turns out that these are as good as the single population models for the urban kids and for the suburban kids, but not for the rural kids. So urban, suburban, and rural kids are pretty different than each other in the Northeast, at least in terms of how their boredom influences how they respond to the system. Now, this isn't just specific schools. We had 6 schools. So we were transferring across schools, but we weren't transferring across populations. By the way, this surprised the heck out of us, because if you think that race and ethnicity are what matter, well, in our sample, the urban kids are different than the suburban and the rural. Suburban and rural kids in our sample were all pretty much white, 95% plus, whereas the urban kids we had in our sample were Latino and African American. If you think it's SES, if you think it's money, well, then it should have been the suburban kids who were out, because the rural kids we had and the urban kids were quite lower economic bracket, whereas the suburban kids were in the middle. But instead, it seemed to be urbanicity. It was the rural kids who were different. And there are some indications from other researchers that rural populations tend to be less studied and tend to be less exposed to these kind of educational technology, which may be another factor. In fact, the kids in Maine were using it because the state of Maine adopted it as a state. But typically, rural kids get less exposure. So one of the implications is we need to be thoughtful about who we build our models on and where we apply the detectors. One of the big dangers is that it's real easy to get data from suburban kids for this kind of stuff. But in fact, if suburban kids are different than some of the populations we're interested in, we may be doing a disservice to the other kids if we then use the models. So how do we use the models? Well, for one thing we want to do is see if these models not only predict our human labels, but predict other stuff. So we applied it to larger data sets, and then did things like correlate to standardized exam scores. So for example, gaming a system gets a correlation of negative 0.36 to how they do on the end of your exam. Boredom gets a correlation of negative 0.2. Engage correlation gets a correlation of positive 0.36. And by the way, all results are massively statistically significant. We had like thousands and thousands of kids here. Correlations down to like 0.04 would be significant with this kind of sample size. Can we predict college attendance? So we actually took kids we built these detectors in 2010, 2011. We applied them back retrospectively to data from 2004, 2007, and then got data from the National Student Clearinghouse about whether they went to college. And we found that student engaged concentration and carelessness was associated with higher probability of going to college, whereas gaming system, boredom, and confusion were associated with not going to college. We could tell from a kid's interaction with the assessment system 69% of the time whether they were going to go to college or not. Now, a couple quick comments on it. First of all, you may say, wait, carelessness is good? Well, it turns out that carelessness is positively associated with going to college until you control for student knowledge. Once you control for student knowledge, then it's associated with not going to college. Carelessness is the disengaged behavior of generally successful students. And this goes back to work by Clements in the early 80s, showing that students who become careless tend to be better academically. So that doesn't mean carelessness it doesn't matter. It just means that carelessness is a problem that you get when you've got a student who's doing well in general. Another thing you might say is 69% is not that great. You know, we can make models based on kids' socioeconomic status and various things like that can do actually up to 90%. But one thing to point out is that these models may be more actionable than that. If you take a kid who is gaming a system or getting careless, maybe you can do something to reduce those behaviors. If you take a kid whose parents don't make very much money, what's the intervention on that one? You can say, hey, I'm noticing you're less likely to go to college because your dad has a bad job. So tell your dad to get a better job. It's not as effective an intervention. We are also able to predict not just whether the kid will go to college, but whether they'll go to a selective college, according to Barron's rankings. Our model for that is the same features, but does a little better. And we can predict, oh, this is wrong actually, it's published in 2014. We can predict whether the student who was bored, who was gaming the system or careless in middle school math, whether they're going to go into a STEM career, whether they're going to major in STEM when they get to college. Don't know the career yet, we just know what they're going to major in. Turns out, by the way, I don't remember if I had a slide for this, but in recent results that we're submitting to LAC in a couple weeks, you might say, all right, a kid games the system and they don't major in STEM 6 years later. What do they major in? Anyone who hasn't heard this want to guess? Healthcare. That's actually one of the top ones. It's not quite the top one. It's like number 2 or number 3. Law. We don't know because the pre-law is not a declared major. Business, actually. And by the way, gaming the system has a Cohen's d of about 0.57, which means that there's like a 0.6 standard deviation difference in how often you major in STEM based on whether you are in the top part of gamers or not. Sorry, I actually got that backwards. The people who don't major in STEM game the system 0.57 standard deviations more than the people who do major in STEM. So further work, I hope we'll be able to do later on, is to go further forward still to post-college choice of job and success in career. And that's going to be easier to track when this population lands on LinkedIn. As part of our procedure for getting their majors, we actually got their permission to follow them and became friends with them on LinkedIn or Facebook. And now we're going to wait 2 years, and then we're going to start studying, how long are these impacts? So how do we use this information? We have 3 ways. We want to empower teachers and guidance counselors, do automated interventions, and also try to find what the most engaging and least engaging content is. So another LAC submission to come. Our guidance counselor reports. We've developed, in collaboration with guidance counselors in Massachusetts, reports that we can give them, which tell them for the students in the school, for every student, what's their at-riskness for not going to college, and what factors are making them more at risk. So, for example, this student here is doing well at math. They're not getting bored in class, and they're seeking help appropriately, but they're getting careless. This kid is not getting careless. They're seeking help appropriately, and they're not too bad for boredom, but they're not doing very well at math. These kids require completely different interventions. And this is a way to get the information to people who can do something with it. Actually, one thing that surprised me a little bit was the guidance counselors asked us only for reports for kids near 50% chance of going to college. The schools we are working with have a ratio of 471 to 1, students to guidance counselors. And so they were only interested in the students who were kind of at the cusp. Automated interventions. This is a picture of Scooter the tutor, who looks happy when you use the software appropriately and looks unhappy when you don't. Middle school boys love this, actually, and they try to make it look like this. So they intentionally misuse the software to make the dog angry. This is actually it's like almost a decade-old study because I've moved much more towards reporting and other things. But this intervention reduced the number of students who game the system by half, led them to catch up to the other students, and students hated it with a passion. Except the students who made Scooter angry intentionally. They love it. We've also done some stuff looking at what content is more and less effective. So, for example, for reasoning mind, we actually were able to find out that the lessons kind of split into two groups, the more boring lessons and the less boring lessons. And we were able to, in other work with cognitive tutors, identify specific design features. So it turns out that, for example, if you give math problems that have no scenario, it's just like an equation, students are relatively engaged. If you give math problems with a rich cover story that really, engages the student, draws them in, like there's a problem about the Iditarod dog sled races, and the math's embedded in the context, students are engaged. But if you give them a hokey problem, a brief problem, one that has a cover story, but it's a very brief one, like Marsha bought 3 T-shirts and Jim bought 2 T-shirts, and it cost $10, how much was each T-shirt? Those kind of problems disengage students. I see some nodding here. Some audiences find this very surprising. Other features turn out that things like ineffective hints, if the hints didn't work, if they didn't lead students to the correct answer very well, students game the system more. If the hints were abstract linguistically, more gaming. And if the user interface was unclear, more gaming. And this, to some level, is kind of obvious, but it's still nice. It's a nice piece of evidence that software designers shouldn't just kind of slap together the interface for a new set of problems. They should really make sure to get the UI parts right. So the big idea, and to conclude, thanks to the big data now becoming available on student learning, and a combination of data mining and knowledge engineering, expert domain in the domain, we can make inferences about students in real time that predict long-term outcomes. And towards tracking a student's engagement now, predicting the longer-term impact of how they're disengaged or engaged, and intervening to help re-engage them and support their learning. Towards helping to create an educational system more sensitive to individual learners' needs. Oops, and I thought there was another bullet there. But I guess this is a good last bullet anyways. It's a good last bullet. So if you're interested in learning more about our work, all the lab publications are available online for free, with 1 or 2 exceptions. Just Google me. And we have a Twitter feed and a Facebook feed where we put all our papers. So thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ryan. Obviously, you can see why we wanted to introduce some of his work and his thinking to the UTA community. Question at the back?
I'm going to be painfully blunt. How do you get IRB approval for handling data long term with individual identifiers like that?
That's a fair question. So that was actually a relatively complicated procedure. First of all, I don't actually have, under my identity at Teachers College Columbia University, the identifiers. Who has the identifiers are the people who built the assessment system, who got permission on the basis of the fact that they were evaluating the long-term impact of their educational intervention to be able to do the long-term.
Okay, so you basically do research on data, so that exempts research from IRB.
Right. In my lab at Teachers College does not have the names.
Got it.
But the group at WPI that built the system has the names, and they legitimately have to have the names, because how can they provide reports to teachers and the system to students if they don't have it? So yeah, so that, negotiating that and getting that to work was a non-trivial process, but it is possible.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments, reactions?
Is this data available somewhere online, or your actual data, not publications?
Some of it is. So as brought up earlier, I don't have the identified data, but the assessment system, Neil Heffernan, I don't have web here, so I'm not going to do it. Neil Heffernan makes massive amounts of data on the assessment system available, and a lot of it is annotated with our detectors. If there's a specific part of the data you wanted, I could definitely get you a copy of it.
I mean, without the names, of course. I just want the data and the ground truths without the names.
So you want the detectors, the field observations, and the log files. Yeah, we can do that for you for several of our systems. Shoot me an email. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the sampling procedure, because in educational research, most of the times data come from convenience sampling.
That's right.
So based on the data, how can you make inferences about population?
Well, so there's convenience samples and there's convenience samples. And one way to start by saying that is that aside from a few people like Beth Tipton, people aren't doing a very good job, a very thorough job of figuring out what schools are similar enough to generalize, and we don't really even know for this kind of model because we didn't have any reason to believe that rural was going to be the different ones. In this case, this was a semi-convenient sample, which is to say that the schools we got the data from were schools that were selected to represent a mixture of ethnic and racial groups that were using the system, and regions. So Massachusetts and Maine are the two largest regions for the assessment system. We had 4 schools in Massachusetts, 2 in Maine. The 2 Maine schools were both rural. The 4 Massachusetts schools, 2 of them were urban, 2 of them were suburban. They represented the 2 largest urban districts using assessments and 2 suburban districts that have been using it for a while. Are these perfectly representative of all suburban schools? No, they're not. We don't have the tools necessarily as a field to figure out, because again, Beth Tipton has done some similarity analyses for RCTs, but no one's done similarity analyses for these kind of things. In terms of how you would even get to that, you'd have to do a really large study to be able to figure that out. To my knowledge, this definitely represents the largest study by my group or any others in collecting samples from a varied and diverse population to build these kind of automated detectors. You can always, actually that's not true, it's the second biggest. The biggest is by Reasoning Mind, which did, I think, 10 or 11 schools in West Virginia and Texas that again tried to cut across. But we're not trying to just use a convenience sample, we're trying to be representative. But to some extent, the fact that we collected data from Worcester rather than, well, for example, Worcester rather than Boston. Boston doesn't use assessments, so Boston wasn't an option. We try to get away from a pure convenience sample. We just don't just go to the most convenient schools, because certainly driving out to rural Maine would not have been our choice for that. Nor, for that matter, for the Reasoning Mind, would have going to West Virginia been the most easy option, given that they were based in Texas. But we don't go to the thoroughness, say, of Beth Tipton and how she designs her populations for RCTs.
Would you clarify, you passed it pretty rapidly, the difference was in the rural kids versus the urban and rural?
Sure. Do you mean in how well the models functioned or in the populations themselves?
Well, the population, I think, actually surmised some of that, but in your results, that they tended to result out differently than your...
Yeah. So if you train a model on urban students, it gets an A prime of 0.7. This is across all the models. And this is a training on entirely new students. And you can see that if you train on the urban ones, you can see it just doesn't do so well on the suburban or the rural. If you train it on the suburban, it does okay on the suburban, pretty bad on the urban and rural. And if you train on rural, it's kind of not as good in general, but it's worse on these. Then if you train on all 3 populations, new students from the urban and suburban, well, suburban you're doing as well on the whole population versus just the suburban. Urban you're doing worse, but not the same level of degradation as the other models. But rural, you're kind of still in the same space as just the models trained on totally different populations.
Okay, thanks for going back to that.
Oh, no problem. I did just jump past the slide. Yes?
Do you know whether or not the rural students typically have computers in their home?
So actually I do in this case, because these rural students are in Maine, and Maine is a 1 laptop per child state, and these were early deployments. These were relatively early deployments of their RCT. So these ones have a laptop in their home. But as to whether they had the year before,
No.
much less likely, yeah. One thing I want to point out is that in a lot of our research internationally, which I didn't talk about here, we found that students, there's reports in the mid-90s of computer tutors being deployed in American classrooms and kids staying through lunch and coming after school to work with computer tutors. That doesn't happen in 2014. It didn't even happen in 2003 when I first started doing field observation in classrooms. But in the Philippines, you see patterns just like in America in the 90s, because it's exciting to have the computer tutors. I suspect that the rural schools, probably part of the difference is familiarity with the technology, and even if they're familiar with computers, familiarity with educational software. That one, by the way, as this kind of stuff gets more deployed in rural schools, if that hypothesis is right, then we should see this go away in 8 to 10 years. Especially as every kid in Maine has the 1 laptop at home. Other questions or comments?
Any comments or questions?
I just have one, probably personally for you, Ryan, the implications of doing this kind of research and how that will change school structures from one teacher directing instruction to more and more computer-based systems to help expedite learning for kids?
The way I look at it is, if you look at the technologies for education that have been successful in K-12, they're all, none of them have a let's replace the teacher focus. They all have a let's empower the teacher focus. And they have serious teacher professional development components. Reasoning Mind here in Texas, assessments in Massachusetts and Maine. It's all about equipping the teachers with better information and supporting them. And taking away the parts of the teaching practice that, not the teaching practice, but the student experience that can be done. That, for example, individualized practice is hard for a teacher to do for 25 kids. But in-depth explanations, figuring out where the gaps are, figuring out why students are struggling, and working with those students is something a computer's not as good at. So I see this as part of getting better data for teachers and guidance counselors, and helping them to have better information on what's working and not working, and also developing technologies, for example, that do a better job of the part that they're doing, replacing homework in the textbook.
One more.
Yeah.
Tie on to that, there's been this nice little wave of, it was a famous TED talk about how do we instill grit in kids, how that
Duckworth, yeah.
tenaciousness to stick through it. Does any of that seem to emerge, or smoke slivers of that through your vision?
We get a correlation between grit and gaming a system. Of all our stuff, it's the only one we get a correlation to. It's not a huge correlation. It's about the 0.25 range, negative 0.25. So kids who game a system are less gritty. Grit, there's a pretty big literature on it. I think one of the tricks about grit is that it's relatively measurable. It's relatively important. It's hard to push the needle on. And it's less a moment-to-moment thing. Like gaming a system is a moment-to-moment thing that you can get someone to move away from. Carelessness is a moment-to-moment thing. Grit, persisting over long periods of time. There's another problem, by the way, with grit. I say that, by the way, in a very positive fashion. I love the grit literature. Another challenge, I'll say, is that there's grit and there's wheel spinning. Joe Beck at Worcester Polytechnic has shown evidence that there's a large number of students who use these online learning environments who look gritty because they keep trying over and over something they're not getting, and they're not gaming a system, but they're just never getting it. And so these automated systems, some of them will happily give the kid 40 problems on the same thing. By the 7th or 8th problem, Joe points out, you probably should get the teacher involved. You probably should get the parent involved. The kid should not do 40 problems of the same type and fail them all. Now, a kid who is wheel spinning is showing a lot of grit, but they're not showing good self-regulated learning. They're not showing good metacognition. So I think the challenge is to encourage grit while discouraging wheel spinning, because especially wheel spinning may actually break grit, right? If a kid doesn't have the metacognitive skills to realize, oh my gosh, I'm failing when I'm being gritty, I need help now, that may make them less gritty in the long term.
That's great. I appreciate that.
You mentioned early on that these systems can give feedback to teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at, or anyone else looked at, how do teachers use the information? How do they adjust instruction accordingly, grouping students, whatever?
Yeah, there's, my lab has been doing relatively small studies on this, more qualitative. Thus far, we found that actually it's a real challenge to communicate the engagement data to the teachers appropriately. Teachers are much more interested one big lesson learned, for example, is teachers don't want engagement data from live class. They want engagement data from homework. They feel like they know what's going on in their class, even when they don't. And teachers are pretty knowledgeable, but you can't know 25 kids that one of them is goofing off in the corner of the room. But teachers have not historically been receptive to that data. They've been receptive to homework data. Guidance counselors kind of want to know what's the biggest problem for this kid, and more than teachers who want to know what's going on today or yesterday. With teachers, the assessments team does some really nice stuff in providing data on student success and student help use, which are kind of a step before this stuff. And teachers have been using it to figure out what problems students are struggling with as a class, and try to identify students they should specifically call on in class, because the student had a mistake that was informative about a specific misconception. There's actually, I don't have a web now, but there's this great video by Kim Kelly, who is a teacher in Grafton, Massachusetts, which is a suburb. where they had Kim do lessons for her classes with the data and without the data to do and they have videos of it. It's really, really nice evidence on how this stuff can be used. Thank you. Yes.
I may have asked you this in another setting, but I'll kind of ask it again. Second language learners, was that part of your study? I'm wondering if students are ever disengaged because they're simply not comprehending and shutting down.
Yeah. Actually, I think it's relatively likely. In fact, in this study, we didn't actually have IRB to ask about status, though we could clearly see it, but we didn't record it. There has been relatively little research on second language status and how it impacts these kind of things in these kind of technologies, and I think that's actually a really huge limitation. There has actually been pretty good evidence that second language learners actually do better with these kind of technologies than they do in more traditional curricula because the technology is kind of more patient in some key ways. Technology will just sit there while you look a word up. And they tend to have more graphical representations. But yeah, that's actually a really important area for future investigation, and one that actually I think George and I have been talking about just today, about how we need to do more for that, because we know, for instance, that students from different cultural backgrounds respond to that same educational technology differently.
Yeah, I think the local districts here are, I don't know what they are, but a significant percentage are second language learners and have issues of poverty, et cetera.
Yeah, I think those, especially as America is changing, and Texas in particular, I think these issues are really important, and they're not getting the attention they deserve.
Well, it's a paradigm shift for teachers, I think, to start thinking in terms of data and the way that you use data, particularly classroom teachers. We do pre-service teacher education. And so I think, though, that idea, that sort of data set, I can help you with your English language learners, this software, these things. I think packaging it that way would be a better sell, if you will, here in Texas, or things, because I think they definitely know where their deficits lie in their instruction and things like that, but it's a matter of connecting it to then what do you do when you have 30 kids in a classroom and, those sorts of practicalities.
And to be honest, it blows me away that none of the major educational technology platforms have been translated at scale. My lab has translated specific lessons into, we translated one lesson, the one with the puppy, into like 7 different languages to do studies in different countries. But Reasoning Mind, Cognitive Tutor, all these things, they're not being translated at scale. And that just seems like such an obvious limitation for use in a country that has a lot of second language learners.
Is there any that's developed specifically for second language learners where it wouldn't be a translation, but it'd be a direct create? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The difference between translating and actually.
There are systems designed to support acquisition of the language that of course are tailored. But as far as math systems go, I'm not familiar with. I'm not saying to say it doesn't exist. I'm not familiar with any systems that have been designed specifically for that population. There are systems designed in other countries for those populations. And I actually think that's a really important thing you're pointing out, because one of the things we learned when we studied, for example, our intelligent tutors in Mexico was that students responded in fundamentally different ways than American students. Whereas American students tend to use the system individually and maybe ask the neighbor or a teacher for help when they get stuck. Students in Mexico, we observed, my postdocs observed, I wasn't there personally, we observed the students kind of seeing the problem, kind of pulling back from the computer and like in groups of 3 or 4 or 5 talking about it, coming to an answer, going back to the computers, typing in the answer. If it was wrong, they'd go back out and have another little discussion. So kind of using it in a fundamentally more collaborative fashion. And we saw that pattern in Mexico, close to Brazil, but we've never seen it anywhere else in the world, including our stuff in Europe, Portugal, Belgium, and the Philippines, which is kind of fascinating to me that Brazil looks like Mexico and Costa Rica, not like Portugal.
Well, what you're saying echoes James G's research on it and, description of affinity groups in terms of how people socially and collaboratively learn video games.
Yeah, I definitely see the analogy you're making there. That's a